Oh yeah, right after this, they brewed an Alios Ale, and
Based on the book.
and Deb is going to tap the firkin right after this. Firkin. Okay, so we're here to celebrate the release of my second novel, Argren Blue. It's Deb's first novel, where Deb's my partner. We wrote it together. We're still together, right? The idea for this book came when I was writing my first novel, Spirit Sight. And Spirit Sight, at its heart, is the first story in a trilogy. And at its heart, it's the story of how this peaceful people called the Alaos fight back against an authoritarian empire. And when I was writing that first book, I started to think, well, how did these people learn to fight back? I mean, they have no history of warfare or violence. So that's what this story tells. It's been out since May 18th. We've had a number of reviews, and they've been beyond our expectations. And one of the things a lot of people say is a can't put down kind of book. And for me, that's one of the best things an author can hear about their book. It's a fantasy, so there's magic, there's action adventure, there's corrupt politicians, there's a mysterious order of female assassins, there is twists and turns. Coming of age and first love, and there's also a little bit of art history. And in fact, one of the themes of the book is the power of art to sway hearts and minds. So when I try to decide what to read at one of these things, my criteria usually is what's going to get me off the stage as fast as possible. And I don't know if you noticed that, Kathy, before, but this time it was a pretty easy choice. Deb and I love the Black Husky. We're here way more than we should. In fact, we come up with a lot of our story ideas sitting at that bar, drinking the best beer in Milwaukee. Woo! So we like it so much we put it in the story. The Black Husky Tavern in the story is a place where the rebels can go and have a beer, get some news, have a little bit of normalcy in their life. And so I'm going to read the first scene that takes place in the Black Husky. A little background, the main character is a young man, 16-year-old, whose name is Alar, and he's becoming a realm walker, which means he can go into the realm of the dead and return. And the dead measure time in eternity, so when he's in the realm of the dead, it appears that time stops in our realm. So far, he's only been at the threshold once, and he's beginning to think it's his imagination. The other character in the scene is a woman named Tove. She's about the same age. She's had a very difficult life that's left her scarred inside and out. And so at this point in the story, she kind of withdraws within herself, hiding behind the veil of her hair. But her arc is the most dramatic in the story. Okay, so they're going to the Black Husky because they've heard that someone is looking for the rebel named Alar. And that's obviously very dangerous. And so we pick up the tale when they're still outside the city in the forest. Alar glanced around to make sure they were alone and said, "Weapons off," before removing the sword's sheath from his belt. It was illegal for an Alios to carry swords, and though bows were not outlawed, carrying one in a bigger city like Richelieu attracted attention. They retrieved a deer hide they stashed beneath the roots of an oak that leaned out over a small creek, wrapped their weapons, and hid them away. Resting his hand on the hilt of his knife at his belt, he gave Tove a nod and said, "You ready?" She didn't answer, but her face told a story. Her jaws were locked tight, lips working, face paler than normal. "You've been to Richelieu before." He started walking, trusting she would follow. "Yes, but..." She waggled her fingers in front of her face. Alar didn't respond, having said all he could on the subject. Tove would have to find her own peace with it, and she wouldn't do it hiding in the forest. "You remember the Black Husky? It's on Carlin Street. It's not in the best part of town, so stay sharp." Richelieu was the largest city in northern Argren and was the seat of the imperial government in the district. Fortunately, unlike its counterpart in southern Argren, Kartak, Richelieu clung to its Alaos roots. Still, the imperial influence was growing, and it was becoming increasingly uncomfortable for the natives. They walked in silence until they emerged from the forest into the road that connected Richelieu to the imperial highway, not far from the site of their disastrous attack on the slave wagon. Yes, Alar asked. Why exactly am I here? I need you to watch and listen, Alar said. We don't know who this person is, what he wants. If we meet him, I'll do the talking. You keep an eye out for anything suspicious. He may have confederates. I could do that. Though he couldn't see her face, he grinned as her auburn hair bobbed in time to her nods. It was well past sunset, and the nightlife on Carlin Street was in full swing. The only light was the dim glow from the open doors and windows of the taverns and alehouses clustered in one of the city's rougher neighborhoods. It was late, the crowd boisterous. Rowdy conversations blended with a variety of musical styles into a festive cacophony. Love that word. They had been standing across from the Husky for 3 hours. Toad wedged herself between Alar and the brick wall of the pharmacy when they arrived and hadn't emerged. He felt her furtive movements as she did her best to accomplish the task Alar set her from her hiding place. Leaf's description of the man looking for him was useless as it applied to nearly half the people on the street. Alar was hoping to get lucky, trusting to the fact that Leaf said the man was making himself conspicuous. The only luck they had was that they had seen no Imperials. Anything? He asked over her shoulder. Nothing. Looks like we'll have to go in and talk to Jorah. He looked back and found Toad staring up at him, her wide blue eyes glinting in the low light. She didn't reply, but she gave him a nod. Alar took one last look at the busy street. Keep an eye out for anyone showing more interest than they should, he said, then stepped into the crowd. Tove took hold of a handful of his shirt and followed so closely he felt her against his back whenever he slowed to allow someone to pass. Jorah's Tavern was one of the smaller establishments on Carlin Street. A handful of mismatched battle-scarred tables were scattered around the room, which was longer than it was wide. Alar spotted Jorah behind the battle-scarred bar, which occupied the back half of the right wall. The proprietor, talking to a pair of patrons leaning on the bar, caught Alar's eye and gave him an almost imperceptible nod. Alar stood inside the door and scanned the room. He was happy to see that only half the tables were occupied. Much easier to spot a newcomer asking questions. Tove fidgeted, jostling Alar's back. He grinned, imagining her dilemma, caught between her desire to get out of the open door but unwilling to enter the tavern before him. Alar wove through the tables, heading for the back of the room. Tove followed, muttering apologies when she tripped over a man's outstretched feet, then ducking behind Alar when he took an unoccupied spot at the bar. She glanced at him, lips disappearing between her teeth, then leaned out so she could see the room. Jorah appeared, slapping 2 frothy mugs on the counter. Alar narrowed his eyes at the mugs and met the bartender's smirk. Ostera possessed an odd collection of coins, including a few of the iron pennies from the purse he found on the soldier, but they were safely stashed back at their camp, not to be wasted on frivolities like ale. On the house, the big man said. He leaned forward and spoke in a quieter voice. I assume Leaf gave you the message. Alar nodded and took a sip, closed his eyes, and swished it around his mouth. A proper outpost ale. Bright floral notes followed by a clean finish. He swallowed and sighed. When he opened his eyes, the old man was grinning at him. Best ale in Richelieu, Alar said. He set the mug down and surveyed the room. How's business, Jorah? Not complaining, or at least no more than usual. He turned his head to watch a pair of men enter the tavern. Haven't seen your friend today, but he usually comes in a little later. He looked back at Alar and added, been asking all over town. He gave Alar a significant look and moved off the circle of newcomers. Alar watched him go, then looked back at Tove. She was staring at the mug, but when she sensed Alar looking at her, her eyes flipped up to him. Ale? You never had an ale before? Her head shook slowly, eyes not leaving the mug. Go ahead, try it. She peeked up at him again, then she seemed to settle into herself, her face taking on a determined set. She took the mug's handle, slid it over to the edge of the bar, leaned down and sipped. When her head came up, foam coated her lip below her wrinkled nose. She considered for a moment, her eyes on Alar, then leaned forward, took the mug in both hands, and took a bigger sip. She pulled back, eyes in the distance, mouth working. After a moment, her eyes rotated up to Alar, and she nodded. Alar turned away, grinning, leaned his elbow on the bar, and watched the room. An hour later, he was peering into his empty mug when a commotion near the door drew his attention. The 6 men filing into the tavern set him on edge. The way they moved, the cut of their hair, their casual dismissal of everyone around them reminded him of imps or imperials. But these were not like any imps you ever saw. For one thing, almost all imperial citizens had black hair. Though it was difficult to discern the exact color of these men's hair in the low lamplight, it was neither black nor the various red and blonde hues of the Alios. They were also enormous, taller than anyone Alar had ever seen, and bulky. The men passed empty tables before rousting a pair of Alios from a table near the wall. They sat, calling boisterously to Jorah's single server. The atmosphere in the room fizzed. Several people rose and slipped out the door. Alar felt the tension coming off Tove at his back. Catching Jorah's eye, he nodded toward the mercenaries, to the newcomers. "Mercenaries," Jorah said, "from the Union." When Alar frowned back at him, he added, "From across the Southern Sea." Alar looked back at the men. "That's new," he said. "Why do the imps need to hire mercenaries?" "Word is the Emperor picked a fight with someone he shouldn't have. The imps need men. This lot has been causing trouble all over town since they got here." Jorah's server Jenna looked as skittish as a deer as he set mugs in front of the laughing men. Lars, leaning on the bar, stood upright and said, "Hasn't anyone called the gendarmes?" Jorah nodded, for all the good it did. While he was speaking, one of the men wrapped enormous hands around Jenna's waist and pulled her into his lap. Alar was moving before his better sense could stop him. He felt Tove make a grab for his shirt, but kept going. Before he could emerge from the shadows at the back of the room, movement at the door caught his eye. He glanced over and came to an abrupt stop. Uhtred was standing in the door. Suddenly it made sense. The boy knew Alar was from the area, and as naive as he was, he would think whispering when he said the word Ostera would keep him safe. It was a miracle he hadn't been arrested. Alar was still in the darker part of the room, near the back, when Uhtred's eyes slid across him and settled on the mercenaries. His face clouded when he noticed Jenna struggling to escape. Alar watched in horror as the boy crossed the room and tapped the offender on the shoulder. He couldn't hear what Uhtred said, but the men's laughter died in an instant. The big man holding Jenna let her go and unwound himself from the chair to stand toe-to-toe with Uhtred. Uhtred was tall for an Alios, but he had to tip his head back to meet the man's eyes. "Shoda," Alar muttered. He stepped aside to allow Jenna to pass and made his way to the table, mind racing. "Uhtred," he said, taking the boy's arm and dragging him away from the mercenary. "Excuse us," he said to the behemoth, turning his back on him and asking Uhtred, "When did you get into town?" Taking advantage of Uhtred's momentary confusion, he urged him into motion. Alar was just thinking he might extract them both from the situation when the mercenary's heavy hand landed on his shoulder. "Hold on there, Los," he growled. His fingers dug into Alar's shoulder. "Me and this boy are having a conversation." The words in his gravelly accent ground together, sounding like an avalanche in his rumbling voice. Uhtred pulled his arm free of Alar's grip, but before he could speak, Alar twisted around and looked up at the mercenary. Despite the tense situation, he couldn't help noticing the thatch of hair jutting from the man's nostrils, and the scar that cut across the left side of his face, leaving his eye a milky orb. Forcing himself to look at the good eye, he said, "I just need him for a minute. You can finish up when we're done." "That's okay," the man said. The grin that had appeared doing nothing to soften his face. "I'll just have to finish my conversation with you." Tove was right about Alar's tendency toward recklessness. What she didn't know is that it was the only way he survived their violent life. For months after he joined Ostera, he froze at the threat of imminent violence, an echo of the helplessness he felt watching the imps butcher his family. Ironically, it was the fear that was at the root of his recklessness. Fear of what might happen to the members of his new family if he froze at the wrong moment. Turn the ring off and dive in head first. It was the only way forward. As the mercenary's iron-hard fingers dug into Alar's shoulder, the jangly frisson in Alar's mind quieted. In the silence, the spot in his mind which had remained dormant since Liren hummed and the lights dimmed. He had to resist the urge to laugh out loud. That was the secret. The spot's song was revealed in the icy calm that overtook his mind in the face of violence, just as it had on the hilltop beside the ashes of Uhtred's home. The mercenary's other hand was rising and forming a fist, but Alar had enough time to glance around the room, noting that it wasn't only the man holding onto his shoulder that slowed. His companions were frozen, their faces showing their eagerness. Uhtred's mouth was open as if he were speaking. He looked up at the mercenary's lips, pulling slowly back from the gray teeth, and punched them in the throat. As suddenly as it dimmed, the light returned, and the world returned to its normal speed. In the stunned silence, the mercenary's gurgling gasps filled the room. He fell to his knees, hands clutching his neck. Alar stepped clear of him as he fell into his side. He looked up at Ukrit, gaping at him, and said, "We better go." As he turned, searching for Tove, the injured man's friends finally recovered from the shock. Chairs, mugs of ale, tables were thrown aside in their haste to get at him. He leapt backwards, catching a mug full of ale in his face. Blinking the liquid from his eyes, he shook his head, trying to provoke the spot into action. No use. The men were still coming at normal speed, spreading out to cut off their avenues of escape. Ukrit, facing the front door, backed up and stepped on Alar's foot. Alar jumped backward, prompting a mercenary to slide sideways between him and the back door of the tavern. Soon, Alar and Ukrit stood back to back against the bar. The mercenary, blocking his path to the back door, leered down on him, and just as he started to speak, there was a crash and the sound of splintering wood. The man hunched his shoulders and turned around. Tove stood behind him, holding two legs of what used to be a chair. She looked from the man to the reins of the chair and then at Alar. Alar slid the knife from his sheath, stepped forward, and drove it into the back of the man's thigh. The piercing scream froze everyone in place. Leaving the knife, Alar reached back and grabbed Ukrit's tunic and pulled him into motion. Shoving his way past the falling mercenary, he took Tove's shoulder and pushed her ahead of him. They crashed through the door at the back of the room. Angry shouts followed them down a short hallway, past the privies, then outside into the alley behind the tavern. Tove shook his hand off and took off. Alar followed, letting Ukrit make his own way. She took the first left down a narrow space between two buildings. Alar could hear Ukrit cursing behind him as the bigger man squeezed through. They merged into the next street and slowed to a walk. Ukrit started, but until Alar cut him off. Later! They heard shouts behind them, but Tove led them through a winding route until they reached the city limits, slipped into the forest, and headed north to retrieve their weapons. "I've been trying to find you. I'm aware. Everyone in Richelieu is aware, apparently." Alar stopped and turned to face Ukrit. "I'm sure you know asking about rebels is enough to get you killed." "I was careful." Alar snorted and turned away. Ukrit caught his arm. Alar turned on him, but when he saw the anguish in Ukrit's face, he hesitated. "Scylla is gone.